you. So until early November, the EGX30 really was the best performing equities market that, well, among the list that we do track, of about 13% until the 9th of November. Since then, however, it's been just one massive downhill roller coaster. It's actually shed over 1,300 points to today's closing number, 13,469.6. If it keeps these up, the Bourse will essentially close the year in the red. MTN's market woes also continue to pile on, down 10.6% in the last 4 weeks. This week's findings by the Competition Commission of price gouging in data just adds fuel to the fire. Vodacom, its other big rival in South Africa, not spared either. Its shares are down by 16% in the same time frame. Here's what's coming up tonight. South Africa's economy has contracted for the second time this year. Data users in South Africa win as regulator rules that prices need to fall. And a Nigerian man's desire to help people with disabilities turned into quite the thriving business. All that and more is in the pipeline for you tonight. But let's start with the macro picture, specifically from South Africa. Its economic output shrank for the second time in 3 quarters this year. The latest data from Statistics SA indicates that GDP contracted by 0.6% in the third quarter. Compare that to 3.2% expansion in the second quarter and a contraction as well of 3.1% in the first quarter of the year. In the first quarter, of course, nationwide blackouts did suppress production. Third quarter activity, however, was hit pretty hard by lower production in mining, agriculture and manufacturing, in what analysts attributed to lower investment by companies and much fewer exports too. Africa's most advanced economy has struggled to tear its way out of a deep slump in nearly 2 years since President Cyril Ramaphosa took the helm. The country now risks losing its last investment-grade rating from the ratings agency Moody's. And we're still in South Africa, where the country's Competition Commission has unveiled the final report of its inquiry into the data service market. The Competition Commission had some pretty interesting findings. It's found that mobile data is too expensive for most people in the country. It's now demanding that service providers reduce these excessive prices by anywhere between 30 to 50% within 2 months or face prosecution. Here's GTN's Angelo Coppola with that report.
Among the recommendations are an almost immediate 30 to 50% cut in prepaid data prices.
I think the Competition Commission is just kind of stepping in with a bunch of quite radical interventions here that I think have the potential to actually damage the market rather than support competition. So I think it does amount to regulatory overreach.
Others are taking a different view and see consumers benefiting greatly.
Most South Africans are just thrilled that someone has identified that data costs are too high. And this is not a regulatory issue. This is a competition issue, and that's a different kettle of fish entirely.
While consumers might be happy, investors and shareholders aren't. Share prices in the listed operators reacted immediately.
I certainly don't think it's a short-term blip, and we also saw some of the smaller players losing ground yesterday. Blue Label Telecoms, which is the biggest shareholder in Cell C, also fell sharply, and Telkom did too. So, no, it's not a short-term blip. I think the investors are taking a long-term view on this regulatory intervention by the Competition Commission, and I don't expect those shares to recover in the short term.
The lack of competition has led to dominant behavior by 2 players in the local market, something that isn't possible in many other markets where there are many more players.
But what we're seeing in South Africa is because 2 companies control effectively 70% of the market, they have been able to impose the prices they want. And the Competition Commission has decided that that is no longer valid. And good for them.
While it might be good news for consumers, in the longer term, consumers are sure to be paying more in a different place. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then, so let's stay with that story. Kuketso Mwesi is the founder and executive director of Amandla.mobi. She joins us now live from Johannesburg. Kuketso, it's good to have you on the program. Let's start with some context, though, for our viewers outside South Africa. Can you tell us what prompted this inquiry into why data prices were so high?
So basically what happened is there was an outpouring of complete outrage from the South African public, right, about the cost of data. So this came at a time when people loaded data on their phones, it would disappear as well. And the charges, as people were traveling, and were experiencing quite cheaper charges, people were shocked because in some instances, it was the very same companies that we had here. And so there was an outpouring of rage online everywhere, and Parliament decided that, it would do something, it would intervene, and a whole set of regulatory bodies, ICASA, which is our communications regulator, along with the Competition Commission, also stepped in. Yeah.
So the Data Commission put forward some pretty interesting data. And basically, there's this one chart I remember reading in the report where they said, like, from 2015, data prices in South Africa are relatively close to the median in about 36 other countries in Africa. But whereas prices started to fall in other markets, they didn't fall by quite the same margin in South Africa over the same time. So what exactly happened? Was this just telcos in South Africa saying, nope, we're happy with where things are, we're not changing our prices?
Absolutely. I mean, they have been profiteering for so long here. So I think with the contention in particular here in South Africa is, right, we have a few number of wealthy consumers. These are consumers who can afford to get contract phones, which are postpaid phones, and they have actually really good deals, can get a gigabyte of data for as little as 30 Rand. But the majority of consumers in this country are actually low-income consumers. And so what happens is, for this group, there has been a consistent increase in prices over the years. And so what you essentially have in South Africa is two internets, right? An internet of the wealthy who can afford to buy big bundles, who have access to Wi-Fi at home, at work, and can therefore enjoy the full spectrum of what the internet has to offer, whether watching news on YouTube and doing otherwise. But you also have this internet of the poor, where people can barely afford to buy significant bundles and therefore remain mostly off then on, which is quite limiting considering how many services are available online. In South Africa right now, just as one example, right, in Gauteng, the province where I am, to apply for public schooling, you have to be doing it online. To register a business in the country, you have to do it online. And increasingly what we're seeing is that both corporate service providers and government are much more responsive online, among many, many other things available, the information and so on. So essentially what is happening is that you have a huge, significant part of our population that is blocked from accessing all that.
Indeed, and of course it just exacerbates the inequality that we see in South Africa. One of the lines that stood out from the Commission report was that poorer consumers, in their words, are being unduly exploited relative to wealthier ones, as you pointed out. It seems to me, though, that there's a prima facie finding here of predatory pricing, but we're not seeing any fines just yet. Why?
So I suspect, the fining, right, they would pay the fine. I mean, considering how long they've been ruthlessly profiteering for, I mean, it wouldn't be too hard to pay a fine. Whereas I think this offers an opportunity to really shift the game. And I understand, I mean, in many ways, they're getting off lightly considering how long they've been up to this, right? But I think that the Competition Commission's report is so critical. For far too long, the two dominant players have been allowed to distort competition and also this kind of ruthless way of operating, right? And so I think for me, just the fact that the Competition Commission has placed on what is most important, which is immediate relief for consumers so that we can increase the spread of access in the country. That should be a priority. And in many ways, there's a whole set of other things around transparency, and the provision of a lifeline package, which would be a minimal amount that is of data given per day that is free, that is given. But I think what we're seeing here as well is a recognition that it is not ideal that private companies are providing the service because, the internet should be a public good, right? And we should be moving towards universal free access. But there's also an understanding, which is also mentioned in the report, but there's an understanding that this is going to take time. And for right now, the majority of our users are dependent on prepaid mobile data, right? And offering relief to this market right now is essential.
Indeed. Kokatu Moeti, thank you very much for your time this evening from Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, we're still on that particular theme about the cost of data right across Africa. Let's take you to Ghana for this next story. Citizens there are pretty outraged by what they say is pricey internet packages that have been rolled out by telecommunication service providers over there. And remember, the same companies that you see in South Africa, MTN in this case, are the same ones you're going to be seeing in Ghana. Now, with the latest introduced rates, consumers of data from companies like MTN, for example, will have to pay nearly $4 for 1 gigabyte of mobile data. Now, remember, in a country where income or the earnings of the average person are pretty low, relatively speaking, especially to income, that's extremely expensive, and it would essentially contribute to keeping a lot more people offline. Let's discuss this a little further. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai is joining us now live from Accra with more details on this. So, purely on a price basis compared to the rest of the continent, Nabil, Ghana has, relatively speaking, some of the cheapest data costs in dollar terms in Africa. So, explain to us from a Ghanaian perspective, why are there these protests?
Thank you very much, Ramah. Let me give you a background to this whole story. So for some period now, a lot of Ghanaians have been complaining about poor services from these telecommunication networks. They complain that they are not getting value for money, especially when it comes to the use of data. For instance, they say when they buy data, the internet is sometimes very slow and they are not able to do much with the data that they buy. Now, in 2008, the government introduced what it calls a communication service tax of 6%, and these telecommunications networks decided to absorb the tax. In December this year, in August this year, in the mid-year budget, the government reintroduced the communication service tax and increased it from 6% to 9%. Now, these telecommunications network decided they would not be able to absorb the whole 9% of tax that has been imposed on them by the government and decided to transfer it to the consumers. So we saw an upfront deduction of data and also call credits whenever consumers were buying data and also call credits from these telecommunication networks. And a lot of Ghanaians were not too happy about the sudden change of the system. The government decided it would intervene and ordered these telcos to stop the deduction, upfront deduction of customers' data or call credits and find a new system of really taking this tax that has been imposed on them of 9%. Now, just this month, from 1st December, these telecommunications networks decided to reconfigure their system, which saw the fact that when formerly used to buy a 1 gig data of $2, let's say, now it's jumped to $4, and this is what the cry is all about. The fact that now data has become so expensive from $2 for 1 gig to now $4, just for the fact that the communication service tax of 9% has been shifted to the consumer, and also the government told the telcos to stop allowing data to expire. This means that when you buy the data, you could use it for as long as you want, unlike what it used to be where there was a limit to the use of the data. And now there is a hashtag on social media campaign called Save Our Data, where a lot of people are trying to hit the streets to push the government or the telcos to provide better services, Ramah.
Right. So one last question for you. MTN, from the data that I've seen from the regulator in Ghana, MTN is a pretty dominant player in the data space. It is home to at least 90% of the 4G connections. By the end of last year, it accounts for nearly 60% of 3G connections as well. As far as the regulator is concerned, though, is this a competitive market, or does it need to rein in MTN in order to enhance and have more competitive pricing across the board?
Ramah, there is already a competitive market when it comes to the use of data or even making calls here in Ghana amongst the telecommunications network. In 2011, the government introduced what it calls the mobile number portability to make sure that the competitiveness is really achieved. This allows anybody who is on a particular network to actually move to a different network to make calls or even to buy data and use the internet. Because if you feel you're not happy with a particular network, let's say MTN, you could, on your same MTN number, port or move or switch to Vodafone or Airtel Tigo and buy data or call credits and make calls or also use internet. So that system is already in place. But with what is currently happening at the moment, we don't know what the government will really make about this. But we understand that the government is actually meeting with these telecommunications network to see the way forward, because there has been a lot of complaints from consumers. Consumers are dissatisfied by how expensive data is, and which has been as a result of this communication service tax, Ramah.
Indeed, we leave it there for the time being. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, live there from Accra, Ghana. Right then, away from the business of telecommunications, let's run through some corporate headlines, starting in South Africa. The struggling state-owned carrier there, South African Airways, has made a $367 million loss in the year ending March 2018. And according to its latest financial report, the embattled airline's liabilities exceed its assets by over $880 million. This comes after the carrier managed to end a workers' strike concerning wages last month. Still in South Africa, the Public Investment Corporation is preparing court papers designed to force Steinhoff International Holdings to release PricewaterhouseCoopers' full audit into its financials. Now, the report gives a detailed account on what exactly led to the retailer's gigantic accounting scandal. The global retailer is also being challenged in a South African court by two media outlets to release that 7,000-page document. Onto the business of energy. In Senegal, Australia's Woodside Petroleum says that the final field development plan for the Sangomar oil field has been submitted to the Senegalese government for review and approval. This effectively should pave the way for the Australian firm and its joint venture partners to proceed with the final investment decision. The first phase will develop some 230 million barrels of crude. First oil extraction is targeted for around 2023. And finally, in aviation, India is considering setting an experience threshold for pilots who fly the Boeing 737 MAX planes. This is part of the country's plans to ensure safety once the aircraft does return to service. India's air safety regulator will also make it mandatory for Boeing to set up simulators in India and for airlines to carry out comprehensive pilot training before it allows those planes to start flying again. The 737 MAX, all its variants, the 9 and the 10, have been grounded worldwide since March after 346 people were killed in 2 crashes in just 5 months. That's a run through your headlines. It's time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore why Air Zimbabwe and FastJet were forced to cancel flights due to operational issues in the country. We'll also explore why Morocco's rural poor are yet to benefit from the economic growth being seen in the North African state. There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference. Let's head on to Zimbabwe now. There's a bit of trouble brewing at the Robert Mugabe International Airport in the capital, Harare. On Monday, the flagship carrier Air Zimbabwe had to cancel all of its flights due to what the airline claimed at the time were operational limitations, not by itself, but at the airport. At the same time, the regional budget carrier FastJet said that technical issues at the airport disrupted most of its flights on Tuesday. So then, what exactly is going on here? Let's find out. CGTN's Farai Makutuya joins us now live from Harare with more data on this story. Farai, what's the status of airspace across Zimbabwe at the moment? Are flights operating normally or are planes still grounded?
Well, Ramah, the Civil Aviation Authority will have us, has been at pains to say that the situation is normal. However, there are these concerns, as you quite rightly raised, around this air traffic control equipment that is there, that is now outdated and has been up and down now for some time. There are points over the last few months where the situation has progressively gotten worse and obviously has caused challenges in terms of the airspace around the country. Last week, we know that a couple of flights couldn't take off or come into the country. We've continued to experience these challenges. So while civil aviation says things are normal, and indeed we do see some flights taking off and coming in, there are these concerns because it is quite clear that this equipment is outdated. It does go up and down from time to time, and because of that, there are these challenges. So the situation, as you quite rightly said, trouble brewing, and hopefully we'll see measures to have it addressed quite quickly because the situation is becoming quite worrying.
Indeed, and we do know, though, that air traffic controllers have been warning for years now that, look, you've got to upgrade this equipment. There was an effort, as I understand it, to do so back in 2016. There was a tender, there was a court fight around those issues. It seems that this process is just taking forever to get done. Why?
Well, indeed, as you said, a very protracted legal process and tender process. The tender was floated, a bidder won it, but one of the rival bidders challenged that process. It was then found that, there were tender procedures that had been flouted, and so efforts to now try and get that process going again have been affected by these legal challenges, but also because, government is trying to clamp down on issues of abuse of office and graft. There are some very cumbersome, very protracted procurement regulations and rules now, and so trying to follow that to make sure that everything, all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed, I think is what is causing these delays. Also bear in mind that, unfortunately, there have also been some, personnel changes in the civil aviation at the top level, senior level of the Civil Aviation Authority, and so the lack of continuity has also contributed to delays in terms of procuring this equipment. But what we've heard in the wake of these challenges that have now been brought to light by the air traffic controllers is that it has been made a priority, and hopefully by mid-December, we're told that's the deadline that's been set for procurement of this equipment, to have it at least purchased and then installed and up and running.
Right. One last question for you, Farai. We've seen quite a bit of upheaval in other parts of the civil service in Zimbabwe. Healthcare, for instance, junior doctors have been on strike for weeks now. The government responded by firing them, and that essentially is a pay dispute in that particular sector. Are air traffic controllers also having a similar dispute with the government, and are they likely to go on strike?
Well, Ramah, as you quite rightly said, I think everyone across this economy is feeling the pinch, and it is because of that erosion of incomes. We know that, they are also feeling the pinch, and that they have raised these concerns and these grievances. How they'll be addressed by the civil aviation will determine what course of action they take next, whether they will engage in an industrial action. What many, workers are doing here is that they are pleading incapacitation, and so they're saying, we want to come to work, but we just simply can't afford to. We don't have the money to put in the fuel in our cars, or to get onto public transport to come to work. So how the civil aviation responds to these grievances and these demands for more pay will determine what the next course of action is. I would imagine that given the sensitivity around the airport, around airspace, they will be willing to give it give it a quick response and to give in to some of these demands that these air traffic controllers and indeed other airport workers may have.
Indeed, we'll leave it there for the time being. Farai Makutuya in Harare. Thank you. Now, we're still in Zimbabwe, though. The United Nations has raised the alarm of what is being described as one of the worst hunger crises in more than a decade. The global body says it plans to procure food assistance for 4 million Zimbabweans. Right now, as we speak, half of the country's population is food insecure. And their situation has been further exacerbated, as you just heard in my conversation there with Farai, by runaway inflation. That's well over 300%. CGTN's Beryl Oro takes up the story.
Once the breadbasket of Southern Africa, Zimbabwe is facing an unprecedented climate-related disaster, affecting crops and livestock, coupled with a debilitating economic crisis.
Extreme weather and an economic meltdown have pushed those people into severe hunger. And for a country that used to be the breadbasket of Southern Africa, the situation is nothing short of tragic. There's no other way of putting it.
The World Food Programme said it was concerned the situation might worsen for the country's 7.7 million food insecure people, with no rains assured for the main growing season.
This is all part of an unprecedented climate-driven disaster gripping southern Africa. The country has experienced normal rainfall in just one of the last 5 growing seasons. Below average rainfall is again forecast for January through March 2020, which is the main growing season ahead of the April harvest. And that is, of course, what we call the lean season right before the harvest comes in.
The 240,000 tons of food aid planned to be distributed to 4.1 million people will be procured on international markets, representing a doubling of the WFP's current assistance program in Zimbabwe. The agency aims to purchase supplies from Tanzania in form of maize grain as well as from Mexico and pulses from Kenya and potentially the Black Sea area.
The crisis is being exacerbated by a dire shortage of foreign currency, runaway inflation, mounting unemployment, lack of fuel, prolonged power outages, and large-scale livestock losses. And they inflict the urban population just as well as rural villages.
Zimbabwe President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government opted not to remove grain subsidies next year, a move it says will protect impoverished citizens from rising food prices. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
On to Nigeria now. The authorities over there have unveiled the first transport-focused university in Katsina State. That's in northern Nigeria. The university was jointly constructed by the China Civil Engineering Group and the Nigerian federal government. Speaking during the unveiling ceremony, the President, Muhammadu Buhari, pointed out that the establishment of this university should support the development of the country's transportation sector. This project was part of the Nigerian railway modernization plan. It seeks to urbanize the West African country by improving its infrastructure. The China Civil Engineering Group intends to cooperate with the new university through teaching some courses.
We will work with the Nigerian Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Transport to strengthen contact with relevant Chinese educational institutions to jointly operate this transport university.
We believe that Transport University is conducive to promoting Nigeria's transport infrastructure, achieving independent and sustainable development, and promoting further cooperation for mutual benefit and a win-win progress.
You're watching Global Business Africa. It's time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The decade between 2010 and 2019 is on course to be the warmest on record. And we'll also be looking at the environmental benefits of going electric when we come back.
No one again began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives. News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Let's recap the stories making your headlines at this hour. A factory fire has killed at least 23 people in Sudan. An explosion triggered the Khartoum tile factory blaze. Witnesses say that a gas tank exploded while it was unloading a shipment. Police have cordoned off the area. Emergency operations are ongoing. At least 45 people were injured in the wake of the blast. Employees from various nationalities are among the casualties. Also in East Africa, several people have feared death in Uganda following a landslide. The affected area is in the Mount Elgon region. It's in the east of the country. Search and rescue operations are ongoing at the moment. UN peacekeeping troops in the meantime are said to step up their coordination with Congolese armed forces in order to offer better protection, they say, to civilians. The peacekeepers will also help combat armed groups in the eastern end of the DRC. This comes as 4 people in Beni were killed in fresh protests against UN and Congolese forces too. And finally, the World Health Organization says Africa has made pretty good progress in the fight against HIV and AIDS in the last 4 decades. But they say it must marshal more commitment and funding to end the disease. Rwanda is hosting the International Conference on AIDS and STIs in Africa right up to the weekend. That's a run through your headlines. All right, then let's talk about climate, shall we? Temperatures between 2010 and 2019, they look set to make it the warmest decade on record. That's according to the latest data from the World Meteorological Organization on the sidelines of this year's UN Climate Change Conference. Now, the data also suggests that this year is expected to be the second or the third warmest year ever.
The last 10 years have been the warmest period during this 170 years period. So far, the warmest year was 2016, when we had a very strong El Niño, which was boosting the warming. But if you look at this graph, you can see that the warming still continues, and there's no indication of phase out of the warming. We have 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and in all of those we have again broken records. And the carbon dioxide concentration is highest in 3 million years, and 3 million years we had 2 to 4 degrees warmer planet than today, and the sea level was between 10 and 20 meters higher than today.
This year's COP25 conference is expected to lay down the framework for a new phase of climate action. The 2-week event comes as global efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions fall essentially on the brink of failure. With the latest, here's CGTN's Filio Contrafuri.
This is an urgent situation, and it's been highlighted day after day by all this alarming data and the reports that have been coming out. And actually, there's even more alarming data that's on the way. For example, today, the second day of the conference, the World Health Organization is presenting its own global survey called Health and Climate Change that will be explaining the effects of climate change on the human health. Now, according to the World Health Organization, if the measures that are outlined in the Paris Agreement were implemented, that means that over more than 1 million deaths would be avoided globally across the world every year. Also, the World Health Organization says that the environment risks that are linked to climate change are responsible for more than 12 million deaths every year. And despite all this alarming data and all the strong language that we've been hearing since yesterday, especially by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said that the Earth is moving towards a point of no return for climate change, it doesn't seem that yet all this has served like a real wake-up call, because what everyone has been talking about here is the way to deal with climate change is multilateralism. It's about united action, that all this is tackled globally, and if there's any wake-up call, it will be translated into action.
And we're still firmly on climate issues. Our reporter Wei Lin Tang caught up with the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, on the sidelines of this year's Asia-Europe Cooperation Dialogue. They spoke about the gravity of climate change and if it's still possible to limit temperature rises as called for in the Paris Climate Agreement.
There's a recent UN report stating that countries in the world are still not doing enough in bringing down greenhouse gas emissions. It said that cuts have to be faster and deeper. In fact, I think it said that emissions have to drop by 7.6% per year, 2020 till 2030. Realistically, in your opinion, is this possible?
If we work together, we can make it happen. That means that we have to work together with a strong commitment. While I'm happy to work with China, I am deeply concerned about the policy of U.S. government, who President Trump has announced to withdraw from Paris Climate Change Agreement. Climate change is a global challenge. It requires global solution. There is no country in this world who can address this one alone. Now, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has warned in October 2018 that unless we contain the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'll have no hope. But there will be increasing sea level rise, and this Earth will get more and more temperature. Therefore, I ask whole world's leaders to work together with the United Nations to make sure that the climate crisis is addressed properly here.
Have we reached the tipping point of a potential climate catastrophe?
I think we are on the tipping point. Unless we are taking urgent action, we will have to regret, which might happen to our humanity and our planet Earth. Planet Earth is now on fever. The temperature, global temperature during the month of July this year was the hottest one in 140 years. So that means the nature is giving us a strong warning that unless we take urgent action to address this issue, we will have to regret for our succeeding generation.
Fundamentally, what are the structural changes that are needed?
First of all, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible. China has been doing a great effort, then United States, and we have to transform this fossil fuel based to renewable energy, which does not emit greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, we must really listen to the voices of nature. Nature does not negotiate with the human being. It is the human being which has to take urgent action now. Otherwise, we'll have no hope.
The U.S. state of California has long been battling high levels of air pollution, in part because of its unique geography, the weather, and the increasing number of people in vehicles over there. In 1967, the Clean Air Act gave the state a special exemption and allowed it to set its own air quality rules, which are even stricter than those set by the federal government. 52 years on, however, the current U.S. President, Donald J. Trump, wants to revoke that waiver, as our correspondent Eddie Stiansian now reports.
California has long enjoyed its independence over establishing its own air quality standards through stricter regulations on carbon emissions and tailpipes for vehicles. But U.S. President Donald Trump wants to revoke that exemption from federally set standards. President Trump announced the move in September, suggesting that rolling back on tailpipe and emission standards would allow for cheaper and safer cars. He said the increased production would also lead to more jobs. Since then, the state of California has taken Trump to court to prevent the move that has also triggered heated debates in Congress.
You know, when people talk about the cost of a dirty car and how it may be more expensive to upgrade to a cleaner car, it's important that we understand that the cost of a dirty car also includes my nephew's nebulizer. It includes medical costs.
Some experts have argued the cost-benefit analysis of the administration was flawed.
The argument used by the Trump administration was that we should only account for the domestic benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, and to the best of my knowledge, there's really no scientific reasons to make these parameter choices.
Speaking to CGTN following his testimony, Bento explained the administration's move is not just about cheaper or safer cars.
We have seen almost from the time when Mr. Trump was the candidate for the president, this desire, so to speak, to bring back the coal industry. And part of the argument was by arguing that all environmental regulations, and in particular the idea of moving forward with aggressive climate policy, was going to destroy pillars that were essential for economic growth in this country.
But California is not caving in. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti announced last week an ambitious plan to reduce carbon emission 25% beyond existing commitments over the next 6 years. Ford, Honda, BMW and Volkswagen had initially announced their commitment to California emission standards, but were later issued a civil subpoena by the Department of Justice to explain their voluntary agreement. Company executives approached by CGTN at the LA Auto Show shied away from elaborating on their policies, currently caught in the middle of a fight between the state and federal governments. But rights groups emphasize the stakes go beyond just California and the car makers.
There are 14 other states and the District of Columbia that follow California standards. So if the Trump administration attacks California standards, they're also attacking the rights of other states to have cleaner air for their constituents.
With so much at stake, the ongoing legal battle could likely end up at the Supreme Court. It is Tian Shan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
The German car maker Volkswagen is facing one of the UK's largest ever class action lawsuits. Over 100,000 British customers accusing the car maker of misleading them with emissions cheating software that made it appear as though their diesel-powered vehicles were environmentally friendly. As we now know, they clearly weren't. CGTN's Catherine Drew takes up that story.
Well, teams of legal officials arrived at the commercial division of London's High Court here, representing the hopes of around 90,000 motorists. Their grievance is one that has been heard before in the US and around the world, that drivers of Volkswagens, Audis, Seats and Skoda cars bought diesel cars in the belief that their emissions of nitrogen oxides were substantially lower than they actually were.
Consumers have been lied to by a multinational corporation, and they want to hold that corporation to account. In other parts of the world, Volkswagen have come out and held their hands up and apologised. They've been fined billions and billions of dollars in the United States. In the EU, they've said they've done nothing wrong and they won't compensate our clients, which is ultimately why they're here today.
The scandal, dating from 2015, has seen criminal charges brought against individuals and the VW Group admitting that 11 million of its diesel cars were fitted with the so-called defeat device software that switched engines to a cleaner mode during emission testing. The car maker reached a settlement with both US authorities and US consumers that reached billions of dollars. But so far, there has been no payout for the roughly 1.2 million UK drivers who say they have been similarly affected.
It's the wider issue around pollution and air quality that VW have nearly contributed to a global scandal around air pollution. And we all have a right to breathe clean air.
VW faces pressure across Europe. A lengthy trial is already underway in Germany, and similar legal action is expected in other countries. The company says the instigation of legal proceedings in the UK is unfounded and that it will robustly defend any litigation. It says it has not been established that the software in question is an illegal defeat device under EU regulations, and that customers have not suffered any financial loss as a result of this issue. Catherine Drew, CGTN, London.
And we're still in the car sector. 2020, if you're in the market for a new car, 2020 is the year you're going to be seeing the big car makers flood the global market with electric vehicles. But how exactly will these brands produce all the electricity to power their new products? And are electric cars really the answer to dealing with the emissions problem? Here's CGTN's Ucho Koronko with this report.
Transforming the way we travel is an essential part of tackling the climate crisis. The transport sector contributes to roughly 20% of global carbon emissions. As a result, electric vehicles have become an important part of meeting global goals on climate change. They feature prominently in mitigation pathways that limit warming to well below 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is in line with the Paris Agreement's targets. But how do they really work? The basic principle here is simple. Electric vehicles have an electric motor as opposed to internal combustion engine. Instead of petrol or diesel, EVs use a lithium-ion, which is a rechargeable battery to create power. That battery consists of a large rack of cells that send electrical energy to an induction motor consisting of two main parts, the stator and the rotor. When electrical energy is directed to the stator, a rotating magnetic field is created. This provides the mechanical energy which is needed to make the wheels of the car turn with speed, controlled by the frequency of power supply to the motor. In the meantime, electric vehicles might be often hailed as the solution to climate change. However, some still question their environmental credentials. With much of the world's electricity still produced from fossil fuels, the criticism goes that EVs may actually be responsible for more carbon emissions over their lifetime than combustion engine vehicles. Uche Okoronkwo, CGTN, Africa.
All right then, back to the business of trade disputes. France and the European Union say they are ready to fight back of the latest US tariff threats on French products. The US government said it might impose punitive duties of up to 100% on some $2.4 billion worth of exports from France. And that would cover everything from champagne to pricey handbags, cheese and a whole bunch of other products. This comes after concluding that France's new digital services tax apparently would harm US tech companies. The French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire has since then described the US proposals as unacceptable.
Yesterday, I talked with the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who is responsible for this Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. And I told him that we absolutely don't share this evaluation. The national French tax on digital companies' activities is just for re-establishing fiscal justice so that digital giants do not pay 10 or 20 or 30 percentage points less in taxes compared to small to medium-sized enterprise, a very small business or a shop in France. It targets American companies and it also targets Chinese or European companies. It is not discriminating.
Quick run through commodity prices here for you. So we're seeing a bit of a dip coming through in oil prices. Nigeria's oil minister, in fact, said the country is still fully committed, he says, to the output quotas agreed to within OPEC. Timipire Silva says essentially that Nigeria will fully comply, or rather fully complied with its output quota in November. But remember, the data we looked at from the third quarter painted a rather different story. Oil output was just over 2 million barrels a day on average, so output was well above the country's agreed to quota. Brent crude was around $60 or so a barrel at 1500 GMT. Here's what's coming up next. A Nigerian man's desire to help people with disability has turned into a rather thriving business. We'll explore that next.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Rapid economic development has transformed much of the northwestern coastline of Morocco, and it's spurred a fairly lively private sector there. But a large class of impoverished Moroccans is still left behind and living on the margins in the kingdom. Here's CGTN's Terry Wangari with this report.
Mohamed Amrani suffers from back pain. He doesn't know if he'll ever have the means to seek medical help. Amrani's house has no electricity or running water, and he dreams of moving to a better life in the city.
We live difficult life and our situation is not good. We want to change our life for the better. We wish to live in the city and live like other residents in a clean environment and be closer to electricity and schools. We suffer from health issues and do not find medicine. Just yesterday, I felt back pain and I do not know if this is sciatica or a kidney problem.
Amrani lives in Azrou, which is located in the Middle Atlas Mountains east of Rabat. He's part of a large class of impoverished Moroccans left behind by the rapid development that has transformed much of the northwestern coastline with multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. Villagers here spend their evenings in the dark. They have to collect drinking water by donkey from a well a mile away. But water inaccessibility is not their only problem.
We have no water, no electricity, no schools for children, and no hospitals. Even drinking water is not good for us when we get it from the well.
Morocco's rampant inequality is stirring some unease in the country's political class, particularly after protests in the northern Rif mountain region in 2017 and 2018 and the mass demonstrations in neighboring Algeria this year.
The problem is that the government always treats the residents of the mountain as a burden, even though it's a source of income. If there is a will by the government, the problems of poverty could at least be relatively reduced. There is a big gap between the Morocco of the high-speed train, the Offspring, and the Morocco of investment directed towards Africa and Europe. They are not the same Morocco that we see here.
The government says, however, that it's doing all it can to bridge the inequality gap. It recently allocated $770 million to combat social and regional disparities this year as part of a longer program. King Mohammed VI, who sets the policy direction in Morocco, is appointing a commission to oversee a new phase of development aimed at tackling such disparities. But for residents like Amrani, who are in desperate need for basic necessities such as healthcare, the time to address the inequality issue is slowly running out. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Local problems, the aphorism goes, are always better solved with local solutions. Now that aptly explains the driving force behind one man in northern Nigeria and his mission. Here's CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam now with the story of Abubakar Shaibu, a craftsman who's taken the initiative to provide affordable, locally made artificial limbs for amputees.
Scraping, cutting, carving and molding these artificial limbs to shape. Well, that's been a passion for this northern craftsman. Abubakar Shaibu saw a need in the region 20 years ago and decided to bridge the gap. He uses rubber from the sole of shoes and leather to make the artificial limbs. What started out as a humanitarian gesture now earns him an average $500 per job.
When I started this, I was making them for free, but then eventually the doctor said I should start charging for my services. When I started charging, I was making a whole lot of money. But then I began to feel bad for having to collect money from someone who lost a part of their body. However, the doctors insisted and people around convinced me and told me that it really didn't matter because I was still helping people. They said that I'm truly helping these people because what they give me is nothing compared to what they would spend if they travel abroad for treatment.
Nigeria's north has the highest concentration of people with missing limbs. Diabetes, polio, the ravaging insurgency attacks and Sharia punishment account for the high number of amputees in the region. Many here cannot afford costly prosthetic implants, so the demand and pressure is high for Abubakar and his team of 30 who produce manually.
The problems I currently face are usually due to the fact that all my parts are handmade. The workmanship could be very slow as compared to using a machine. So sometimes deadlines are hard to meet because the demands can be high due to how affordable my work is. I get really tired and unable to make as much parts as demanded. This work takes a toll on me because it requires a lot of strength, time and concentration. I have to push myself to do it, even on days when I'm not feeling too well. But when the stress gets too much, I take some time off. So if we could get machines, then we would be able to make more and meet more demands.
Abubakar's works are known nationwide with approval and recommendations from orthopedic hospitals across Nigeria. His affordable artificial limbs are bringing hope to many amputees in Nigeria and beyond. He also hopes for a partnership that will help boost production and open employment opportunities for more Nigerians. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Plateau, Nigeria.
One final story for you on a somewhat lighter note. In Cape Town, South Africa, the 2019 festive season is officially underway after the city's annual festive lights switch on event. Crowds gathered in Cape Town city centre to see the mayor turn on the lights.
Thousands packed Cape Town's Grand Parade to celebrate the festive light switch on at a free street concert. Some of South Africa's top musical talent wowed the crowds as they waited for the city lights to be turned on. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Cape Town Festival of Lights, when the city centre comes to life with a display of hundreds of lights to celebrate the holiday season. And it's become tradition for Cape Townians and tourists to flock to the city centre to catch a glimpse of the Christmas and holiday-themed lights throughout December and January.
It's a very important event as far as the city of Cape Town are concerned. It is our own event organised by ourselves. It is to get in the region of 80,000 plus people together to thank them for the support during the past year, to encourage them going into the festive season.
The mayor of Cape Town said the city was looking forward to a bumper tourism season and assured visitors that authorities would pull out all the stops to give them a warm Cape Town welcome.
Cape Town is pretty safe for them to come and visit Cape Town. We're a tourist destination. We will roll out the red carpet for them, and we will make sure that we're friendly. Tourists must know they can come to Cape Town with a very clear mind, a clear heart, to come and enjoy what we have to offer.
Renadal Calm, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Right then, I'll run through some currencies for you. So a fair bit of grim data really coming out of South Africa today. As I mentioned a little earlier in the bulletin, Q3 GDP data did point to another contraction in output. In fact, what was expected was output that was relatively flat, an expansion of about 0.1%. Clearly that didn't happen. And remember, we had an expansion of 3.2% in the second quarter and a contraction of 3.1% in the first. Output in manufacturing, mining and agriculture, those were among the hardest hit, down 3.9%, 6.1% and 3.6% respectively, with deep cuts in inventory seen right across the board. Well then, we'll leave it there for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.